Sri Aurobindo is commenting on the phrase mind of our mind in the Kena Upanishad. And in the previous chapter, he took us through a series of rational steps through which we come to the recognition that in the very nature of the cosmic evolution, there is this consciousness which is beyond mind, of which mind itself is a phenomenon. But the Upanishad, he observes, affirms this mind beyond mind as a result of an intuition and spiritual experience. And here, the Upanishad attempts to teach us what is this mind beyond mind, how does it function, and by what means we can arrive at the knowledge of it and the experience and possession of it. In his commentary, Sri Aurobindo clarifies what the Kena is conveying. As we will see shortly, there are many who, reading the Kena Upanishad too intellectually, have found it contradictory. Because on the one hand it says that cannot be known by the mind, and on the other hand it says that you should know and not this. So it seems as if it is contradictory, but if we look at the use of the Sanskrit words, the distinction is clear. When it speaks of knowing that, it does not mean knowing it by these means of knowing. It means knowing that in a way which is a general grasp or possession, not an intellectual, cognitive, rationally cognitive process of informational knowledge. And so we have to go a little deep and catch the sense of the mood of what the Upanishad is leading us to. And Sri Aurobindo places before us 4 statements of the Upanishad, which we have already seen, but by placing these 4 before us, we are allowed now to go further and deeper into our understanding. First, he says that this supreme cognitive principle, the supermind, is beyond the reach of mind and the senses. Second, it does not itself think with the mind, meaning it has a different way of thinking, a different way of knowing or cognizing. Third, that it is that by which mind itself is thought or mentalized. In other words, our functioning of mind needs that, and without the support of that, this cannot happen. Fourth, that it is the very nature or description of the Brahman consciousness. That thing is the nature of Brahman consciousness. It is the description of Brahman consciousness. And yet, it is not Brahman consciousness in its essentiality, in its absoluteness. And so these fine distinctions Sri Aurobindo will show us. And it is important to be clear of these distinctions, because otherwise we start with a very blurry and even wrong idea of what is the divine, the Brahman, God, whatever name we choose to give to it, and what is our relationship with that. And if our idea of that relationship is wrong, then in our approach in that relationship also, we wander around rather than meeting directly. In understanding this relationship using these 4 phrases, we can take a simple example, and the relationship of life with matter. Living force, living energy in plant or animal or in human compared to rock. And we find, for example, using the same vocabulary, that is life, is beyond the reach of matter. Second, it does not itself operate by matter. Third, that it is by that matter is created and works. Without that, matter could not function. And fourth, that is the very nature of the true essence of matter or life. So if you put it in that relationship, you can see something, you get a sense of what that is in relation to us. You can experience life energy. Matter cannot experience life energy, and yet life energy can experience matter. Life energy can enter into matter and animate it, make it alive, and when it withdraws, matter falls back to what it was. During the time when it is animated, matter thinks, oh, I am alive. And we say, no, you are not. It is life force which is animating you. And if it were to withdraw, then you wouldn't be alive. And matter says, what is that? I am able to feel. It is me. And it does not know until the life force withdraws what it really was. And in this relationship, we again get a sense of how supermind relates to mind. Mind says, I think, I know. But all our thinking and knowing is possible because that works through this. But in the working, the life force as it enters matter is dulled, it is suffocated, weakened. It loses its immortality and its freedom. In the same way, when the supermind works through mind, it is by a reflection, by a reduction, by a breaking up into fragments that it operates, and we do not see supermind for what it is. So these are some analogies which help us to better relate to. The key, though, which comes through all these analogies is that there is a relationship which is very close, which can become intimate. Without that intimacy, matter cannot express itself as living matter unless life enters into it intimately, becomes as if one with matter, and dynamizes from within. In the same way, unless supermind enters into the functioning of our mentality, mentality cannot know. The very act of knowing, the very experience of knowledge or dealing and arranging with knowledge is possible because of this intimate operation of supermind, although diluted, although reflected, although reduced, although fragmented. Still, it is that which makes this possible. If that somehow withdrew, then our mind would not be too different from the operation of what we see in lower animals. Only this morning, a little bird came into one of the rooms. I don't know how it entered. And it could not find its way out because part of the panel was of plastic, transparent. It kept hitting against that, trying to go through it. So I went and opened the doors. All it had to do was drop down 6 inches and it could fly out. But somehow it refused to because there was a band of green wood. It somehow refused to look below that. And after trying in every possible way to communicate, I said, oh, you are stupid. But the operation of its mind, the operation of its thinking is driven by a kind of an instinctive sense mind working, does not have rationality and intelligence, self-aware as in the human beings. And so if the supermind withdrew, we would find our mind dulled in a similar way. Not too different from what happens when we are in a half-sleep state. And at that time, if you try to think normally, you'll find your mind moving in grooves of emotions, whirling, swirling, round and round mechanically, unable to stand back and free itself from that muddy, sticky movement. It's only when you wake up that you look back at those thoughts and you say, my God, this is so silly, because you're able to disengage. And so there is a equally an ascending movement of the mind where that light from above can fill more and more directly and act more and more directly. And when that begins to act, the mind suddenly feels itself greatly intelligent. It looks at things, it understands, it's so simple, it's so obvious. It tries to understand, it knows profoundly, it sees things in large movements, and so on. And still we may say, oh, it is my intelligence which has become greater. But the truth is, it is the light from above which makes for my intelligence, which has increased. So Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting comment in one of his letters. He says that, that the true intelligence does not grow by thinking. It grows by the development of the psychic and the intuition. So when you read that, if you approached it from the conventional mindset that intelligence is a product of activity, of mind, you would say, what is this? What is he talking about? This is not science. But this is in fact the truth. When the light fills your mind becomes intelligent. So these are some relationships and analogies which help us to recognize that that is not something far away. And yet, what we are experiencing is not the absolute. And Sri Aurobindo now discusses this. When we say, however, that mind of our mind is the nature or description of the Brahman consciousness, we must not forget that the absolute Brahman in itself is held to be unknowable and therefore beyond description. And yet we are saying that this mind of our mind is the description. So we can know, the way the Upanishad says, we should know this mind of the mind. So Sri Aurobindo explains, and we saw this briefly last time, it is unknowable not because it is a void and capable of no description except that of nothingness, nor because, although positive in existence, it has no content or quality, but because it is beyond all things that our present instruments of knowledge can conceive, and because the methods of ideation and expression proper to our mentality do not apply to it. And we saw this extensively last time, so we need not dwell on it, but just to recapitulate, that is unknowable because of an incapacity of our means of knowing. If we could develop our present instruments of knowledge, then we could know that. The current methods of ideation and expression do not operate on it. We saw some examples last time. But all these are only indicative of what is possible. We cannot, for example, we cannot conceive of something which is infinite. We cannot conceive of the timeless. We cannot conceive of something which is not made up of duality. If you try to imagine your experience of the world, there's always something which is more and something which is less. Hotter or colder, happier or sadder. There is always this contrast between two different directions in the domain of experience. But to that consciousness, there is no duality. There is only one spectrum of variations of qualities. We find that difficult to conceive. And one more thing which we cannot conceive is the experience of Ananda, which belongs to a domain of consciousness which is beyond the dualities. And so when we think of Ananda, we think of happiness exaggerated. But in a sense, when we try to think of that in terms of what we know, we are indirectly approaching a certain truth. And the truth is this, which he puts it thus: it is the absolute of all things that we know, and of each thing that we know. And yet nothing, nor any sum of things, can exhaust or characterize its essential being. So when we think of Ananda as the absolute of our happiness or enjoyment or any of our positive experiences, yes, in a way, it is that. But as an absolute, it is not the exaggeration of this into infinity. It is a very different way of being. So if the monkey, for example, looks at the human and says that the human way of thinking is the absolute of my way of thinking, and it tries then to exaggerate its way of thinking, it would still not come close to anything that the human experiences. In our own human experience, we have things which we experience for which we have no words. Try, for example, to explain to somebody what is color. Try to explain what is a harmony in music when certain notes are in harmony or they are in discord. You feel something. Can you explain to a deaf person what is it that makes music to be harmonious or discordant? Can you explain to a machine or some being who does not have emotions what it means to be happy? Now, these are all in the domain of our human experience. We give it a label, but we are unable to articulate something as simple as that. And yet, these are still experiences within the domain of dualities. So, exaggerating them is still not going to take you outside duality. There is a kind of a transition, a kind of a transcendence. If the computer now uses words and says, I am happy, would you accept that it is experiencing what you experience as happiness? I can feed into my computer the vocabulary of human language and get it to communicate with you. It can say, I need more electricity. So you turn up the voltage, and the computer says, now I'm feeling happy. It senses the voltage increase and it says, now I'm feeling happy. You'll say, no, that's not happiness. You have just satisfied a requirement for your survival. That's not happiness. But he says, but that's what you told me you feel when you have a sensation. But that's not it. We are speaking of something totally different. We are speaking of emotions. You don't have emotions. He says, yes, I can. See, I am happy, I am unhappy, I am jealous, I am angry. These are emotions. No, those are words. Those are not emotions. You can't convey to it an experience. It can play all it wants with the vocabulary. So in the same way, we find that there is a kind of a transcendence where there's a leap that takes place, which gives us the sense of a gap. This is the reason why in many traditions, many religious traditions, you will find the concept of God, because it is the absolute that is referred to. The concept of God is something which is far, 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 far away. So far away that you can do nothing to reach it. All your efforts will fall short. And so the whole focus of the religion moves to entering in relation with representatives of God. So they could be angels, they could be saints, they could be human vehicles, prophets, and so on. And even in one particular community that I was interested to observe, they want to meet saints, including those who have passed on, because through their bones, through their body, through their material expression, you can come to some sense of material closeness to the divine. All of these are perhaps valid in their own way, but they make you feel helpless in the sense of being able to relate to or ever know or experience the absolute. The approach of the Kena Upanishad, though, is very different. It shows you that there is something you are able to attain to by which you can know that. But this mind and its way of cognition cannot attain to that. But this mind has a capacity to go up to a certain point, which is the highest that it can go. At that point, that highest station is able to enter in relation. And then there can be a very different kind of cognition, a different power or faculty of knowing, which will take you all the way to that. And so we have a link point within us and within the reach of our capacity. And it is to that it points when it repeatedly enjoins that know that to be the Brahman. And it says, know that That is not the absolute Brahman, and yet that is something knowable through which you can know the absolute Brahman. So Sri Aurobindo is now putting in relation this world which we experience and that reality. It, the Brahman, in its essentiality, is the absolute of all things that we know and of each thing that we know. So first idea is all things. Conceive of all things that you know or that you could know or even beyond what you could know. The whole universe and the past and the present and all the possibilities of the past, present and the future. And take all that and take it to its absolute. That would be the Brahman. And of each thing that we know, and here's the interesting part, you can take one flower, you can take a grain of sand, a drop of water, your body, an idea, an eyelash, a piece of something which could be discarded as waste, mud. Any finite thing, object, experience, force, take it to its absolute, and it is also that. And so for the mind, briefly, there is a point of confusion. The absolute of the whole and the absolute of the piece of the whole. How can it be the same one? But if the mind is able to move beyond the sensory attachment, then it is able to recognize this. In fact, it is not such a big deal. In mathematics, we are able to show this very easily, that the absolute of one part and the absolute of the whole is still the same. Or an infinitesimal can map to something infinite, or even that a finite piece can map to something infinite. And even there can be many infinites and greater infinites and so on. I've mentioned this several times before, but in one of the experiences we had a professor of mathematics, Dr. M. Venkataraman. He was equally a mystic as a mathematician. And in our last 3 years of the school that we had him, he led us into an experience where he went into the essence of all mathematics, pure abstraction of 6 different structures of mathematics, and then showed how all reality can be reduced to these essential structures. Then he showed how from one structure the next is implied, from the next the third is implied, and so on, taking us all the way to the 6th from which the first is implied. And then he made a circle and said, and so all this is one. And you went into this aha experience. All reality was abstracted to these 6 structures, and then these 6 flowing into each other merged into one. And you had some kind of an epiphany. But still, a mental, a mathematical, abstracted perspective of a sense of oneness. Equally in mathematics, we have this idea which I have mentioned before of the absolute omega, capital omega, where you can show how there are infinities, and then there are layers of infinity, greater infinities, and there's an infinite series of infinities, and those go on infinitely. And is there ever an absolute? And then mathematics does one trick of an abstraction, of a transcendence. It says, all these infinities together, when you put them together, that is capital omega. That is the absolute. So the absolute is defined by the inclusion of all possible infinities. The conceptual power of the mind cannot hold this as a picture anymore. But with the abstract representation of infinities, we say, yes, that makes sense. And we can show then that this absolute has the same characteristics as the Brahman we describe here. It is the sum total of all things and yet transcends them always. You can cut it up any amount you want. Each is still the whole completely, and so on. All these things appear. And it is done mathematically by the mental understanding. But none of it is still experience, knowledge that we have by experience. So I'm just pointing to these things to show that there are tools within us by which we can already begin to glimpse truths of that though not yet that in itself. It is the absolute of all things that we know and of each thing that we know. The implication is it is also our absolute. When we reach to our highest potential and transcend even all possibility of conception of what we can be, there in that absolute, we have that also. We are that. And yet, nothing nor any sum of things can exhaust or characterize its essential being. So you cannot say this and the absolute of this completely describes or characterizes it. It always exceeds all the possibilities of absolutes of things and the absolutes of the totalities. It exceeds. And then, for its manner of being is other than that which we call existence. When we say existence, there's a certain way of being that we say, this is existence. Its manner of being is other. And rather than saying what that other is, he shows again by contrast. Its unity resists all analysis. Its multiple infinities exceed every synthesis. So there are two things here by which the mind knows: analysis and synthesis. If you bring before me a toy and the toy does something unusual, I start wondering, how does it do this? How does it do that? In my mind, I cut it up and try to see what are the different forces, processes, parts by which it is able to do this. Or if I cannot do it by mind, I physically cut it in order to be able to see those things. And then, having seen those pieces, each of which I am able to perhaps cognize, I put them back in that relationship, which also now I can cognize because it is a sum total of many individual pieces, all finite. And then the whole thing together, now working, I say, now I understand. Now I can explain. Now I can articulate and teach you what I have learnt. But that is not available to this process of analysis or synthesis. So first he says, its unity resists all analysis. If you take this object, the toy, it is a unit. It has a unity. But you can split it open into pieces and forces and therefore make an analysis. But if there is something which is unity, but a unity which is not formed of parts and pieces, how would you split? That which is indivisible in its unity cannot be cut up. You may try to cut it, but in the very act of cutting, you will find you miss. I'll show you an example which is accessible to our mind of how this could happen. Imagine yourself now a fish. We have used this image before. We are fish in the ocean of self. Our own body is formed out of the water of the ocean, moving in a certain rhythms, repeating the form. So I say I am separate from ocean, but I wander in ocean. Now, I, the scientist fish, says I am going to analyze this ocean and cut it. So I have to create a knife to cut. But from what material shall I make the knife? Out of the water, obviously. So out of the water, I make this knife structure. And then I take the knife and start cutting through the ocean. You can imagine what will happen? The knife itself is part of the ocean. All my attempts to cut it can never ever divide. And so the very tool you use, being a product of that, can never know something which is transcending it. So the very tool you use is part of the process of your limitation and can never know something which transcends. So all the analysis which we do to its unity fails. It resists. But you can go through the exercise of cutting with the knife the ocean and cutting off a partition of the ocean and cutting a cube of the water and say, this is cube of ocean, which I have now taken for my analysis. What you do not see, of course, is that the cube is never cut off, that the current is flowing right through, and the knife itself is part of that flowing current. Everything is changed in the very moment of your cutting. It ceases to be what you thought it was, and therefore you can never know it. So in the same way, you can go through a mental analysis and you will cut out your little cubes or your little facets or pictures or forms or systems or structures, and you'll say, now I have got it. But if you actually pursue the analysis, you will end up with something which contradicts your starting point. And so when the rational analyst faces this, he says, oh, this is Maya. It is a power of deception. It deceives me. I cannot know it because it is a deceptive power. And that is a wrong understanding. I cannot know it because of my incapacity, not because the power deceives. You see, so in any theory, in any philosophy, you will end up with points where your starting assumptions are questioned by the conclusions of the assumptions. You can never complete to make a self-contained, complete knowledge base. Now again, this is not a new idea to mathematics. There is in fact a very famous theorem which says that if you create any system of assumptions and build a whole knowledge base out of it, the knowledge base itself can never explain itself if it is finite. It's a very interesting idea. If you make a finite set of assumptions and build from it even an infinity of ideas, this leads to that, which leads to that. The thing itself which you have created can never explain itself because your starting point was something finite. It can explain itself, in other words, know itself if your starting point is infinite. But then if it is a starting point that is infinite, you can never articulate it. So it is beyond your articulation. Reality, if it should know itself, must start with an assumption which is infinite. It cannot start on a finite assumption. And therefore, our mind, which is only capable of handling finites, cannot know reality, can never fully know or understand or describe or reduce to finite terms of formula the nature of this reality. It's a very simple idea and demonstrable mathematically, but it has such a profound implication. And this is the direction in which Sri Aurobindo is pointing when he says, its unity resists all analysis. And the other side is the synthesis, the power to join pieces together. Its multiple infinities exceed every synthesis. So when you bring a synthesis, you take two different or more pieces and bring them together to form a unity, a whole. But it offers you not pieces, but infinities. And not one infinity, but so many infinities, unendingly infinite series of infinities. Anything you can conceive of, there is something which transcends even that, unendingly. And all these, if you try to bring together to form a synthesis, you cannot. First of all, you cannot handle each piece, which is an infinity in itself. Second, you cannot join them because the infinities are so diverse, they do not always fit neatly in a very simple sequence. It is utterly free. It can throw out all possibilities, including contradictions, which to us are contradictions, which to its infinity are completely acceptable. And so we can never join the pieces together. This is the problem we find in all the great philosophies. Each school of philosophy articulates a great truth and aspect of the divine, and even a true aspect of the divine. But when you bring these aspects together, they don't fit perfectly into each other. In India, we have Shad Darshana, the 6 Darshana meaning revelations of the divine, ways of seeing the divine. We use the word Darshana because at some point it exceeds intellectual formulation, and yet it can be expressed intellectually. So there are schools of philosophy, but each begins with a vision and an approach and an experience of the divine. But when you bring the six together, they don't fit into each other. You may even find certain things contradict each other. I was meeting a scholar who is also a yogi in his own pursuit, and he was speaking of this Shad Darshana, the six visions, revelations, and then he said, but they contradict each other. And so somebody asked, but how do you unify them? Then he said, you can only unify them in the experience of the self. And that's the right answer. There is an experience in which all these are seen as aspects, but none completes, none is sufficiently complete to say that this is good enough to represent the self. Perhaps even there are other ways of looking at it, which could be formulations of or mixtures of these six, but the freedom of the self is exceeding all these formulations. But in the experience of identity in the self, you find all these are simultaneously present as aspects or ways of approaching self. In the experience, one can have it, but all attempts to synthesize fail because its multiple infinities exceed every synthesis. And so obviously, if analysis and synthesis is not possible, then mind cannot know it. Therefore, that's why he says, therefore, it is not its absolute essentiality. It is not in its absolute essentiality that it can be described as mind of our mind, but in its fundamental nature in regard to our mental existence. So when the Upanishad says mind of our mind and know that, it is not pointing to the absolute nature of Brahman, but the word Sri Aurobindo uses, its fundamental nature in regard to our mental existence. What is this fundamental nature of Brahman in regard to our mental existence? If from the mind existence you look towards Brahman and wish to capture something of its essential character, what distinguishes it from your mind, then you would say it is mind of our mind. If through the senses you approach and try to characterize what it is, you would say sense of our sense. And so on, speech of our speech, and life of our life. These are the four facets that the Upanishad is leading us through. But now what happens when you look at it from the other side, from the absolute towards us? And Sri Aurobindo now states this. It's simply, beautifully and concisely stated. Brahman consciousness is the eternal outlook of the absolute upon the relative. Brahman consciousness is the eternal outlook of the absolute upon the relative. If you meditate on this, you'll find it takes us very close to something which begins to approach what the Upanishad wants us to feel. First, we see that the relationship is decided from that side, not from this side. From here, we cannot know that. But from that, it can know this, because this is an expression of that. So it is the absolute when it looks towards what? Towards the relativity which is its own expression. And when it looks upon that relativity in its eternity, that is Brahman consciousness. So it is something which comes from the absolute towards us and can be known only when you know the absolute, and from the absolute turn to meet the relative. In the journey towards the absolute, you cannot know it because at least your initial part of the journey is an attempt made by this fragmented consciousness. There will come a point when you will as if make a transition to a different way of knowing, and then you can begin to know it more. But it is only when you reach in identity with the absolute, then you can know what is Brahman consciousness, and it is the relationship of that absolute with the relativity of its manifestation. That is Brahman consciousness. Now, when we state it in these terms, you will find it comes very close to articulations from various traditions. In Buddhism, for example, we have this different vocabulary because the Buddha said no Atman, an-Atman, whereas the Vedantic tradition said Atman, Atman, realize Atman, self, and Buddha said no self. So even to this day, self or no self, it's a big problem of conflict in the philosophies. And yet, what Buddhism says is that absolute, it describes it as a void, that absolute has a nature of being. The vocabulary they use is dharma kaya. Dharma, that is dharma, truth, natural law, truth of being, essential truth. Kaya is body, form, form of the absolute. What does that mean? And when you ask them to describe it, the description approaches very closely to what we would describe as Satchidananda. But because it transcends mind in every way, they will say it is, they will refuse the words love, delight, ananda, even consciousness, because always consciousness and all these terms belong to the domain of fragmented consciousness, of relativities. And yet you have to give a word to it, and you develop a vocabulary eventually. The nature of the absolute is dharmakaya. And this is what we are seeing here in a different way. Brahman consciousness is the eternal outlook of the absolute upon the relative. Now, this being the case, Sri Aurobindo goes a little further in the logic of the Kena Upanishad. But even of this outlook, we may say that it is beyond the reach of mind and speech and senses. So how can we know it, even if we want to know Brahman consciousness, not Brahman in essentiality? Even that we can say is beyond our reach. Yet, mind, speech, and senses seem to be our only available means for acquiring and expressing knowledge. Must we not say then that this Brahman consciousness also is unknowable, and that we can never hope to know it or possess it while in this body? Yet, the Upanishad commands us to know this Brahman and by knowledge to possess it. For the knowledge intended by the words vidhi, avedit, these are the terms used in the Kena. The knowledge intended by the words vidhi, avedit is a knowledge that discovers and takes possession. So the Kena is saying you should discover and take possession of this. And it declares later on that it is here in this body and on this earth that we must possess Brahman in knowledge. Otherwise, great is the perdition. And this is the text in the next chapter of the Kena Upanishad. It says this, that you must know it here, otherwise there is a great perdition. So here's the problem now. We have seen that even this knowledge of the consciousness of Brahman is something belonging to a different domain. And we would logically say, therefore, it also cannot be known. But the Upanishad is not saying that. It is saying you must know and possess. So Sri Aurobindo says, a good deal of confusion has been brought into the interpretation of this Upanishad by a too trenchant dealing with the subtlety of its distinctions, based on the knowability and the unknowability of the Brahman. So if we go very logically and say, oh, here it says knowable, there it says unknowable, what is this confusion? He says, we must therefore try to observe exactly what the Upanishad says, and especially to seize the whole of its drift by synthetic intuition, rather than cut up its meaning so as to make it subject to our logical mentality. In the vocabulary here, he is using this word drift, the drift of the synthetic intuition. That means there is a part in our consciousness that leans towards, drifts towards some kind of an experience, some kind of a knowing. And we must allow that drifting movement to culminate in whatever it is leading us to. The way the mind works, it catches, and in the act of catching, it cuts up, breaks out. And only when it has been able to break out and hold a piece, it says, now I have, now I possess. But this whole vocabulary of drifting is a sense of opening, giving ourselves, allowing something to emerge, to fill, to merge, to join. If the fish scientist, rather than trying to cut the water with its knife, would allow the water to carry it, or if it would allow the water to fill it and to open its senses to its own way of looking at itself, that would be closer to how we should approach the Brahman. So here is what Sri Aurobindo is going to show us. The Upanishad sets out by saying that this ruler of the mind, senses, speech, and life is mind of our mind, life of our life, sense of our senses, speech of our speech. And it then proceeds to explain what it intends by these challenging phrases. But it introduces between the description and the explanation a warning that neither the description nor the explanation must be pushed beyond their proper limits or understood as more than guideposts pointing us towards our goal. So all these descriptions are only helping us in a direction. They are not it. In the Buddhist tradition, they will say, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. It is pointing in a direction. You have to go in the direction, not catch the finger. For neither mind, speech, nor sense can travel to the Brahman. Therefore, Brahman must be beyond all these things in its very nature. Otherwise, it would be attainable by them in their function. So, starting point is this: our mind, senses, speech cannot reach it. All right. The Upanishad, although it is about to teach of the Brahman, yet affirms, we know it not. We cannot distinguish how one should teach of it. So you can say, I cannot teach, but it does not mean I do not know. Just as you would, if you are asked to explain to the blind man the experience of color. I don't know how to teach it to you, but I know it. And that is the nature of the rishis who express the kena. The two Sanskrit words that are here used, vidmaha and vijanimaha, seem to indicate the one a general grasp and possession in knowledge, the other a total and exact comprehension in whole and detail by synthesis and analysis. So there are two very different terms used in the Upanishad. We'll see the text later, but this, for now we just get the idea. There are two different terms used here in the vocabulary. One term, the second one, is the knowing in analysis and synthesis. And the other is the term which is vidmaha, which is to grasp, to possess in knowledge. The reason for this entire inability to express is given, and he quotes, because Brahman is other than the known and it is there over the unknown, possessing it and as it were presiding over it from above. It possesses the known from beyond the unknown. The known is all that we grasp and possess by our present mentality. It is all that is not the Supreme Brahman, but only form and phenomenon of it to our senses and mental cognition. So you see here there are two limitations. The first is what we grasp and possess in our present mentality is this, but what we are grasping is form and phenomenon of it, and as it is limited to our current senses and our mental cognition. So a blind man looks upon the world with his hands, and the range of his sight is the reach of his hands. The Seeing man looks upon the world with his eyes, and the range is the range of his eyesight. So I can see about, in a flat land, about 10 kilometers away. Beyond that is horizon. I do not see more. I look up, I can only see sky. I cannot see beyond. Even at night, I see only these little dots of light. But the scientist, expanding the reach of his sight, is actually able to photograph nebulae and galaxies far beyond, which these eyes cannot. So it's as if there is an amplification of the tools of knowledge by which we are able to see much more. And yet, we are still bound in the range of visible light. So with my tools, I expand even that range. I can see infrared, ultraviolet, and radio waves. But still, I'm only seeing what waves can see. And I'm only seeing what is reflected from the surface. And I'm only seeing what reaches me after dilution of a long journey and distortions through that journey. I do not see the thing itself ever. There has to be some power by which I can see the thing in itself directly, know it in itself, and only then will I truly know. So these are all limitations of our current sense and mental cognition. And then he says, the unknown is that which is beyond the known, and though unknown, it is not unknowable. If we can enlarge our faculties or attain to others that we do not yet possess. So, two things are required. Our faculties have to be enlarged, and there are still higher faculties which are possible within our reach but which we do not yet possess. And when those faculties open, then we will be able to know it. It is not unknowable, though unknown. And then the Upanishad teaches us how to develop those faculties, how to get to that point where we will be able to know it. And that's the description in the next paragraph of Sri Aurobindo's commentary. But now we will just look back at the second part, second chapter of the Kena Upanishad. And there are 5 verses which Sri Aurobindo has translated, which describe what he has been explaining here, but in the language of the Upanishad, which is also very pithy, suggestive, and intuitive. And we will just read that and dwell on it, meditate on it for a while, and we will continue the study on the Sunday after next. Next Sunday is the 7th, and we will not be able to meet on that day. We will continue this on the 14th. So, part 2, verse 1. If thou thinkest that thou knowest it well, it being Brahman, if you think that you know it well, little indeed dost thou know the form of the Brahman. That of it which is thou, that of it which is in the gods, this thou hast to think out. I think it known. So if you think about it, and if you try to grasp it by thinking, then you will know very little, and then only of its form. But if you think of the part of it that you are, the part of it that are the gods, this you have to dwell on. And then it says, I think it known. So there begins the access to the knowledge. Second verse, I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. So this is our experience. I don't know it well, meaning in my domain of knowing well, which is my intelligence, rationality, and senses, I don't know it well. It is vague, it is formless, it is something abstract, somehow unreachable to my grasping, forming power. So, I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. Somewhere inside we feel this familiarity, we feel this sense of closeness, even intimacy with the divine. He is of us. So he of us who knows it, knows that. He knows that it is not unknown to him. So among us, he who knows it knows that. Knowing this, which is not unknown to you, when you know it, then you know that. He knows that it is not unknown to him. And so the whole description here is of a different level, which is not fully developed in us, but where we sense that we know and we are in relation, some connection, something exists. Third verse. He by whom it is not thought out has the thought of it. He by whom it is thought out knows it not. The moment you have thought it out, then you do not know it because you've reduced to what is thinkable. When it is not thought out and yet you feel, then you have thought of it. It is unknown to the discernment of those who discern of it. By those who seek not to discern it, it is discerned. So when you start discerning, let's talk about Brahman, let's analyze, let's go through a exercise of debate over what is Brahman, what is not Brahman, what is the reality, nature of the absolute, and so on, it is unknown to them. Because you can go on debating forever, as has been done over centuries, as you know. By those who seek not to discern of it, it is discerned. So the discern is the sense of separating. If you try not to separate it and reduce it by analysis, then you know it. But there is a separation still because you know it against that which you know differently. There is a separation, a kind of a discernment. But the discernment itself is known without a rational separation of analysis. Verse 4. When it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. There is a perception that reflects, not grasping, not cutting, not joining, not manipulating, but just becoming quiet and still and feeling, opening yourself to it. And then something of it settles, fills, reflects, lights up. When it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. So in fact, in our existing thinking mentality, one can feel it. And so you can say one has the thought of it. But the way you feel it is not the normal movement of mind thinking. It is still in the domain of thought, but it is a knowing in thought, in the reflection of that. And that's the link point by which we will ascend to it. Then, by the self, one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge, one finds immortality. To put it in a very general way, we're not elaborating now, but the movement of a personal aspiration, the self aspiring, is the force by which one realizes that. And one enters into it and experiences it in identity. That's the knowledge. That knowledge, one finds immortality. So when one feels that closeness, and whether in partial reflection or some partial identification, one feels it, one knows the timeless, spaceless, or eternity, or infinity, and such things which to the mind are not in its capacity to conceive or experience. So by the self one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge one finds immortality. And finally, the fifth verse, which completes this whole sequence, which is teaching us how to know the Brahman and experience. Fifth verse. If here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to the knowledge, then great is the perdition. Here meaning in life, in the body, in the world. If you come to that knowledge where you have the experience of that, immortality, then one truly is. Then you can say your life is real. Your thoughts, your actions, your experience of the world is real. Maybe not yet entirely complete, but it is real. Until then, everything is unreal in the sense that it is only a construction, a interpretation, and a partial, mixed, confused understanding of what the world is, what we are, and our relationship with the world. But when one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. That is the real, that is what puts us in experience of reality, even if it's just the beginning of it. But if you don't come to that knowledge here, then great is the perdition. The perdition here comes from the French word perdre, perdu, loss. And it suggests not only loss of things which you could own, but loss of oneself. So when you don't have it here, then you have lost yourself. You are wandering, unknowing to yourself, unknown to yourself. And the second line, the wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, and they pass forward from this world and become immortal. In all kinds of becomings, that is, in all the activities and forms and experiences of life, the wise distinguish that. And when we begin to enter in relation with the Brahman in all things, feel, sense, see, and relate to that in all kinds of becomings, then they pass forward from this world and become immortal. Always in the Upanishads, this world and the world of immortality is the fragmented consciousness, which is this world, and the consciousness of unity, which is the immortality. So, being here in the body and in life, we pass from this world of fragmented, delusory, and ignorant consciousness to the consciousness of immortality and truth, the Satchidananda. So, this is the part 2 or chapter 2 of the Kena. And Sri Aurobindo is referring to this quite extensively in the passage that we have just read. And you can now see in familiarity the commentary that he made and the text. So we can just reread the last two sentences of Sri Aurobindo's commentary that we read and meditate on it briefly. The known is all that we grasp and possess by our present mentality. It is all that is not the Supreme Brahman, but only form and phenomenon of it to our senses and mental cognition. The unknown is that which is beyond the known, and though unknown, is not unknowable if we can enlarge our faculties or attain to others that we do not yet possess.